Good afternoon. This is Wiebe Nauta. I'm a sociologist of development at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I've been working on the role of activists and NGOs in developing countries around issues of HIV/AIDS, and in recent years I'm researching the role of South Korea on the African continent. I welcome you all to this pre-recorded lecture on globalization and inequality. I am the coordinator of the minor, of the course at FASOS, and the course at the University College Maastricht. It's my first time doing such a lecture from my home. I've asked all my family members to be quiet, and let's see how this works out. I'll look forward to your comments. Now, normally we have the lecture in a big lecture hall at the aula, and there are minor students there, pre-master students of our pre-master program, and the students of UCM. So normally we see each other when roughly 150 students gather. Sadly, these are different times and different days, and this is not possible. Particularly UCM asked for pre-recorded lectures, so that's what we'll try and do. Hopefully it is interesting. The teaching staff this year: Wiebe Nauta, René Gabriels, Angelica Jermanovic, Simone Gavazzi, Sergio Calderon Harker, and Sarah Röder. The lectures that we'll talk about is globalization, development and inequality for today, then colonialism and politics in Africa next week, the agencies of development in week 3, human rights and global justice in week 4, HIV/AIDS and health in Africa in week 5, and migration and development in week 6. And only for the students of FASOS, globalization, food security and inequality in week 7. Yeah, make sure you get the Hopper book. It's behind me here. Get access to the electronic version or to buy a version in town. And also make sure that you get hold of the readings. I just posted an announcement about setting up a VPN connection if you can't access material from Maastricht University Library. So make sure you come to class, whether it's online or on campus, in case of the UCM students, and come to class prepared. Indeed, as I said, you get the material through the server. All right, let's start with the lecture, Globalization, Development and Inequality. I think it's important to talk about some recent global developments. I think still one of the major developments was the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement, although it's 5 years ago. And the fact that at that time the US and China ratified it very quickly and they were leading. Obviously, a bit of a disaster when Trump announced in 2017 his withdrawal, but let's hope that when a new president is elected, that they can still remain part of this initiative. What we also see in terms of climate is tremendous ecological disasters. The number of hurricanes have increased tremendously. Forest fires now raging in California, last year in the Amazon. And people like Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, denying that there is any problem. Another thing that has defined the last few years are the trade wars, and particularly trade wars that Trump has initiated, his America First strategy, so-called trying to protect the steel industry. But in 2019, it was clear that US farmers, for example, were hurting in terms of their exports. The G20 that met in Osaka in 2019 failed to solve some of the trade disputes. They did something around reducing marine plastic litter, but still quite major issues that they left unresolved. Another interesting and maybe worrying issue at the moment is some of the fights that are taking place in terms of technological companies, particularly when Chinese companies are involved. So there's a global pushback at the moment against Huawei, particularly in terms of rolling out the 5G networks in Europe, in the US. And there is fear in the West that there is, let's say, surveillance software being installed by the Chinese. One of the most dramatic crises that the world is facing in various locations is the refugee/migration crisis. In this course, we are certainly not we are not of the position that we see migration in principle as a crisis, but it's clear that at the southern border of Europe, where we leave people to die, where on the Greek islands people are put in camps under terrible circumstances, where at the Mexico-Texas border children are being ripped away from families, where Australia still has very, very tough migration policies, that this is a crisis in many locations in the world. And hopefully in this course we can look at some of these issues in more detail and also find more nuanced and maybe more positive positions. And then maybe the crisis that is most in our face, in your face, the fact that we are now interacting in this manner, is the COVID-19 crisis. The death toll today lies at around 825,000 globally. In many societies, people are suffering and dying. Families are mourning their loved ones. People have become very sick. People are trying to get access to healthcare. And obviously it also leads to some structural changes in many societies in the world. Take South Africa, for example, where for quite a few months no alcohol was allowed to be sold, which had an interesting side effect that domestic abuse and gender violence decreased dramatically. But it's clear now that it's particularly the poor and vulnerable, like in most crises, that are particularly affected, that bear the brunt of losing the jobs, getting sick, and in higher numbers die of this terrible disease. There are also some positive things to talk about, and you see that in this course the Sustainable Development Goals are a kind of a line of argument, a red thread throughout the course. The global goals that came into being on January 2016, and already in September 2019, last year, we had the first review at the SDG Summit. So when you're looking for material on the Sustainable Development Goals, go to that SDG Summit page and look at some of that interesting material. Maybe a development that is not at the forefront of your attention right now is something that I feel impacts our lives fundamentally already and certainly in the coming years, and that is the One Belt, One Road initiative from China. It is an initiative, it's also called the 21st Century Silk Road. It's an initiative by the Chinese rulers, by Xi Jinping, President of China, to link China to the hinterland and to create direct lines, infrastructure lines to the major industrial centers of Europe, of Asia, and also create links to Africa. So we're talking about roads, we're talking about railroads, we're talking about harbors, airports, and these are huge investments that China is putting into, one could say, development. And I think, life in Europe has already been affected. Looking at some of the ports in Greece, I think Piraeus port, and certainly also in some of the developing countries. In order to talk about an initiative like this, it might be interesting to ask ourselves who this particular person is, seeing here discussing with Donald Trump. And I guess most of you, I would count on the fact that most of you don't know who this man is. He's actually Vice Premier Liu He. He's the Chinese President Xi Jinping's top economic advisor. And he's in fact one of the most influential persons determining and shaping the future of global capitalism. So it's interesting for us to, normally we say, there's the communists and there are the neoliberal free market countries. But at the moment, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that China is a hugely important player in terms of shaping global capitalism. All right, so now we come to one of the basic questions today, and we ask ourselves, what is globalization? You could pause the video and make some notes for yourself, think this through, and then check what answers we come up with. Normally this is a very interactive lecture, so we now have discussions. I listen to input from the audience, and obviously that is difficult right now. I would say globalization is a thoroughly contested term and topic that is in need of ongoing discussion, debates, and clarifications. Now, maybe this is an unsatisfactory definition for some of you, but I think COVID-19 already shows that, with a new development, the processes of globalization are fundamentally altering, and therefore on a daily basis, yearly basis, we have to rethink what processes of globalization involve. Think about the huge rise of mobile technology and how that has impacted our world, and we need to debate in what way it has produced differences in terms of culture, in terms of economy, etc., etc. What are some of the aspects? Obviously, the world is getting more interconnected, particularly through technological innovations. These were simple in earlier times. It was the introduction of the clock, where time was in earlier time village time or city time, and at one time, particularly when the train system was introduced, clocks were needed to have national clocks so that the railways could run and people would know where the train would arrive at what time. The telegraph, the telephone, obviously the introduction of the internet, and then mobile technology. I guess we are at the beginning of 5G, and that the way in which the volume of data will change through 5G will have a profound effect. Something that is also debated in terms of technology at the moment is the role of artificial intelligence, particularly when we talk about the possibility by big companies to practice surveillance, to learn about what we do, what we want, where we go, and where we spend our money. But also some states, nearly all states, in some way or form, make use of artificial intelligence. Some say it's a threat, some say it will be incredibly helpful for the future of mankind. The second aspect is capital and the increasing dominance and fluidity of capital, and particularly the power of transnational corporations. I think in the last 10-20 years, the power of transnational corporations has in some cases surpassed the power of nation states, and companies like Apple, Amazon, but obviously also the big energy companies have huge influence on our societies, on ecology, etc., etc. At the same time, while capital is relatively fluid, the labor movements are still relatively restricted in many places on Earth. Then we see the increasing interpenetration of institutional and political levels, although some say at the moment the supranational institutions like the UN, World Bank, IMF are on the decline. But it's an interesting discussion whether we see a withering of the nation state or do we see a reassertion of the nation state. For example, Trump's America is really about a reassertion of the nation state. What we also see is that no longer it's only the traditional Western countries that are powerful or that are organized, but it's also increasingly emerging powers, new countries like Brazil, like Indonesia, like Turkey, that organize themselves and become important players on an institutional and political level. Yeah, something that I guess we are all familiar with is the increase of cultural interaction. Debates are we becoming homogenized when everyone watches the same Netflix series, whether in Korea or Australia or Canada or the Netherlands? What we also see is the globalization of education and an increasing dominance of certain cultural industries. Think about YouTube and Netflix. Then something that is not often discussed, we do see processes of what is called militarization. Obviously, when we've looked at, or when we think about the role of the US in Latin America in the past, the US has armed regimes, intervened in regimes. What they've done in the Middle East, what Europe has done in the Middle East, is important to take into account when we want to understand processes of globalization. At the moment, it's China that is becoming more and more active, for example, in the South China Sea. The issues in Hong Kong, you could say, are that there's always the danger of military intervention, and there is always talk about the future of Taiwan, for example. Another aspect of globalization is what is called financialization. That means that the financial industry, financial institutions, financial companies, those investing in certain activities of humankind, you could say, has become more and more influential in shaping processes of globalization. Whether it's agricultural futures, whether it's investing in housing and real estate. And financialization, if you could take an example, financialization is the fact that for many, housing nowadays is not primarily something to provide for people to live in, but to see housing as an investment product that needs to turn around as quickly as possible to make as much profit for those that invest in housing or in water or in agricultural resources or in land, etc., etc. The financial crisis in 2008 showed that housing issues in America and the bonds that were sold there and was in fact hugely influential in shaping crises in other parts of the world. So when the banks in the US started having problems, they had sold financial products to other banks globally, and banks in Europe and Asia followed, having these same issues. And then obviously we'll talk about this in the course in many instances. Processes of globalization around health are very clear. We had the SARS crisis, we had the Ebola crisis, and now we see we are in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. And there are global health experts that I speak to that say, we've never witnessed something of this magnitude. So wrapping up, when you think about globalization, look at these aspects and also try and reflect on the fact how globalization affects your personal lives as a young person in the 21st century. There is a so-called globalization classic, a book by Peter Singer called One World, a 2002 book. And he said, how well we come through the era of globalization will depend on how we respond ethically to the idea that we live in one world. And these are exactly the questions that we are now grappling with. You could say the fact that America is pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and obviously that climate agreement acknowledges the fact that American companies have an impact on ecological issues in other parts of the world. According to Singer, this pulling out, you could ask, is this an example of ethical behavior? But also in terms of the COVID crisis at the moment, you could say, what does it mean that rich countries are hoarding vaccines or already ordering vaccines, and maybe in a few months' time, developing countries or poor communities don't have access to the much necessary vaccines. So an important book that helped us think through some of the issues, particularly ethical issues around globalization. Maybe more appropriate at the moment in this day and age is the Yevgeny Morozov book, The Net Delusion. It was a very important book that came out because at one stage people were really positive about the internet, about mobile technology, and always stressed the fact that this is so positive and important for our democracies. But Morozov said, don't underestimate the fact that these are also efficient tools for surveillance and oppression. And we see that now in terms of the dangers of artificial intelligence. I would say, I sometimes feel that we are becoming biological subjects embedded in digital networks governed by artificial intelligence. And in fact, Morozov has made an interesting, there's an interesting clip, a YouTube clip 2018 clip where he talks about the geopolitics of artificial intelligence. Worth watching if you're interested in these issues. And to illustrate this, Vladimir Putin already in 2017 said, whoever leads in AI will rule the world. Google CEO Sundar Pichai said, AI is one of the most important things humanity is working on right now. It's more profound than electricity or fire. That is quite something to say. And then President Xi Jinping, pictured here, he has urged his country to become leading in artificial intelligence by 2030. And they are building a domestic industry worth 150 billion. So there are some underlying questions that we have to think about when we think about globalization. For example, is it structurally new or is there a continuity? There is strong disagreement, and some of that disagreement we'll talk about in the course. The question is, does it actually help to alleviate poverty and inequality, or does it perpetuate poverty and inequality? Again, strong disagreement. But Amartya Sen, also in the article that you read, has an important contribution to make, because he said the question is not just whether the poor too also gain something from globalization, but whether they get a fair share and a fair opportunity. So he really raises the issue of distribution of the fruits of globalization. All right, Amartya Sen, also talks about this inequality. And again, this is a topic that maybe you turn off the video for a sec and ask yourself, what is inequality? Jot down some of the potential answers there. This is, in my view, a bit of an old-fashioned cartoon. What we see here is white men in the north of the globe having a party and having a good time. They seem to symbolize wealthy people. And a poor, I guess, man of color is saying, hey, don't make so much noise, think about us. In my view, this is in a way still relevant, obviously, because quite a few wealthy nations are located in the north and are still holding particular positions of power. At the same time, you could say that this cartoon is completely outdated, because it's no longer only in the north that we find extremely wealthy people and extremely wealthy companies. But in fact, extreme wealth and extreme poverty has been relocated or is located everywhere. If we look at the life expectancy of an average black man in the inner cities of the US, his life expectancy is often lower than let's say the average citizen in Bangladesh. And if we think about inequalities, obviously there are inequalities between nations. I think it's still relevant to say that the OECD countries, the Organization of Rich Countries, are still the richest and most powerful, and they are also trying to protect their position. However, what we also really need to acknowledge nowadays is that there are new players who are in some cases and in some sectors and along some dimensions even more powerful than some of the traditional rich countries. Think about China, think about India, think about Brazil. So I would say that the North-South divide, developed, developing, is no longer the only determining divide out there. Just a few examples to illustrate that. Under the one of the previous Brazilian presidents, Rousseff, Brazil opened 19 embassies in Africa, investing 700 million, or writing off 700 million debt of African countries. In 2012, there was this huge controversy because Qatar was proposing to help the French, rebuilding and renovating the French suburbs, involving 50 million euros. We saw a real turnaround of the situation in the 2008 crisis, when Angola, a former colony of Portugal, was actually sending money to debt-ridden Portugal during the financial crisis, because it had lots of oil dollars, Angola had, and it was helping Portugal to survive. Then, something that most of us are aware of, China obviously is strengthening its presence in Africa, Latin America, the rest of Asia, both in terms of sending private actors, but certainly also as a governmental actor. And in contrast, the Netherlands in the last 10 years has closed embassies in Africa and cut its ODA spending by about $1 billion. So here we see a difference, that some of the emerging countries are investing in developing countries, opening embassies, and some of the traditional players are divesting in developing countries. So these are two pictures from my own research, looking at Korean aid in Rwanda. This is a Korean technological training center in Rwanda, and one of the Rwandese employees. So it's interesting to see what these new players are doing in various developing countries. Something else that we need to think about when we are considering new constellations of countries is that we have various ways in which countries organize themselves and find allies. So we have the traditional G7, that's the US, UK, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, and Canada. The G8 with Russia added, although Russia has was kicked out a few years ago due to its interventions on the Crimea. Then we have an interesting group of countries called the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then there is the G20. So it's the G7 plus the BRICS, plus a variety of emerging countries like Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, etc. And it depends on the topic, but in many instances, the coalition of countries that have a say in world affairs is broadening. Every year we see a so-called BRICS summit. So this is where Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa meet. The leaders meet: Bolsonaro, Ramaphosa, Putin, Modi, Xi Jinping. The last meeting was in Brazil, and here they decide on, how to support each other, how to make a fist, for example, when they are trying to get a better deal from the rich Western countries. And it's interesting, if you look at these figures, that in terms of population, the BRICS are 3 billion, 41% of the world's population. In terms of GDP, 15.8 trillion. That's nearly 20% of the share of the world's total. And in trade, nearly 17%. So it's a huge market that has also grown tremendously in importance. So these countries realized at one stage that, why should we be only dependent on decisions by the West? Let's form a coalition and make sure that our voice is more dominantly heard. Right. We talked about inequalities between countries. It's now also important to look at inequalities within countries. And I think what we see everywhere is that the role of elites, the role of the very rich, has become increasingly dominant in many societies, whether it's the Netherlands or India or Brazil or the US. Some of the examples you might know, the Russian Abramovich, who owns Chelsea Football Club, former Thailand Prime Minister Thaksin sold Manchester City in 2008 to Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan of Abu Dhabi, whose family has an estimated fortune of 1 trillion. But what we also see is kind of more traditional industries getting into the hands of people from other places on Earth. In the Netherlands, our steel industry, formerly called Hoogovens or Corus Steel, has been taken over about 10 years ago by the Indian Tata Steel family. So the jobs in the Netherlands in the steel industry are basically in the hands of an Indian family. So the decisions are not taken in the Netherlands. In terms of these inequalities, it's good to know, but also sad to note that, for example, 26 people in the world own the same as 3.8 billion people who make up the poorest half of the world. That in a country like Mexico, Carlos Slim, a tycoon, commands an income that is equivalent to 17 million poor citizens. Carlos Slim was briefly the richest person on earth and has now dropped on the Forbes list to place 12. But these inequalities of a few billionaires owning the same as more than a billion poor people is something that I think we need to we need to grapple with. We need to discuss it. We need to think about whether this is ethical and how we deal with these particular issues. If you want to measure inequality within a country, we usually turn to the Gini coefficient. The higher the coefficient, maximum 1 and lowest 0, the higher the coefficient, the more unequal society is. South Africa is traditionally among the most unequal societies. Brazil is a notorious country in that sense. So if you want to find out, do I live in a society where wealth is relatively equally distributed, you can look at this Gini coefficient. Countries like Norway and Sweden are among the most equal societies with a Gini coefficient of around 0.25. This is the global Gini map. The red zones are the most unequal, and dark green are the most equal societies. Look at the PowerPoint later and look at the region where you come from and think about these issues. Yeah, so we were talking already about the global elite. what is important is also to realize maybe the three richest people on Earth. Jeff Bezos, the Amazon CEO, owns 113 billion. He has recently suffered quite a loss because he got divorced, but still he's the richest man on Earth. Bill Gates is still in the top three, and a relatively new person is this Larry Ellison. I think he's in textile, if I'm not mistaken. What is quite shocking is that I'm giving these figures on a yearly basis, and if we look at the fortune of Bill Gates, which was 53 billion in 2010, so 1 or 2 years after the big financial crisis, he actually he doubled his fortune in the last 10 years. So in this period from 2008 to 2020, where large group of people in the world saw their real incomes decline or stay constant, someone like Bill Gates doubled his wealth. And therefore you could say that nowadays we see a global society of movers and shakers, and a large section of stagnant poor that influences the way we experience globalization and inequality, and also issues of development. Other divides are what is called the digital divide, a term that Hobsbawm came up with. And it's really interesting for us, I think, as students of development to think this through. Obviously, all of us are well connected. We have our mobile phones and access to internet. But one of the things that is a persistent divide is the fact that the internet is predominantly English in many places, and that the access to broadband internet, whether mobile or through cable, is still not up to par in many places on the planet. So here you see the number of individuals using the internet. This is 2017, so I'm sure it has improved or changed. But Africa only 20%, Europe 80% of people using the internet. There's a clear trend that particularly youth are becoming more connected. So if you look at the world, 50%, 48% people connected, but youth 70% connected. And particularly mobile technology is creating enormous opportunities for young people everywhere. Mobile broadband subscriptions have really gone up. In developed countries, nearly 100%, but in least developed countries, hovering still around 20 to 30%. This is 2017, so I'm sure things have improved since then. What we also see is the ICT Development Index. Basically, it's an index showing where ICT infrastructure is the best, and we see that Iceland is number 1, South Korea is number 2, Switzerland, Denmark, the Netherlands on number 7. And it means that in these countries people can most easily have access to internet, to mobile technology, and to ICTs in terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology, in terms of hardware, software, etc. Okay, so what are some of the other divides out there that might be useful to think about when we think about development, when we think about processes of globalization? I think this graph is a really interesting graph to think about. It starts at the year 2000, and it ends in the year 2050. These are obviously projections, but the question that the authors asked is, where does the middle class live? So in the 2000s, it was the world's middle class mainly lived in the EU, the United States, and Japan, you could say. And you see that due to population numbers, due to changing wealth situation, that this picture is flips over the next decades from the 2000s, and the middle class, in terms of percentage of world population in the EU and the US, is getting less, and particularly India, China sees a huge increase in people living in the middle class, and also other Asian countries. So that means if we are talking about resources, if we are talking about where is spending power, what we must acknowledge is that in India, in China, in other Asian countries particularly, we see huge numbers of people becoming a part of the middle class. Something that is less positive and a serious concern in many places on Earth, whether it's South Europe, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Africa, is youth unemployment. I think the figures are staggering in many places on Earth and really worrying. Hopefully you guys, when you finalize your education, you don't experience these issues. But there are places like South Africa where there's, among certain groups, 50, 60, 70% unemployment. And it's particularly difficult, sometimes even for young people with relatively good education, to find good jobs, good futures, etc., etc. So it's I think one of the challenges that we need to address in the coming decades. Another big issue that is that we have to deal with are important population shifts, maybe also related to what I just said about the middle class. And the example here is the most populous countries. And I would like to particularly talk about Africa, because Africa in 2016 had 1.2 billion inhabitants, and is projected to have 2.5 billion in 2050. And if we zoom into one of the most populous African countries is Nigeria, having a population in 2016 of 187 million, and projected to have nearly 400 million, 398 million people in 2050. And it's really something that African regimes, African governments have to consider. How do we deal with this enormous rise in poverty in terms of employment, in terms of resources, in terms of infrastructure, education, etc. But it's also something that other nations are strategically thinking about in terms of, where are markets developing, where are migration flows expected, etc. So these shifts in population will have a huge impact on many aspects of life on Earth in the coming decades. All right, this is a next question to ask. Normally we would also have a break in this lecture, so maybe you just pause this video for a second, go for a little walk or a little chat, or make yourself a cup of tea. The question at hand is, what is development? And again, normally we have a discussion in the lecture hall where everybody gives his or her ideas on what development actually is, what it means. So pause the video, jot down some notes, and see whether you agree with what we've come up with. In order to answer this question, I would like to briefly talk about Amartya Sen, one of the most influential voices in development studies. Originally, he is an economist, born in India, received the Nobel Prize in 1998 for economics, worked in Harvard, in Cambridge, and wrote several very influential books, Poverty and Famines, The Argumentative Indian, Identity and Violence, and maybe his seminal work, Development as Freedom. When you guys are interested in these type of topics, this might still be a book to buy or to borrow from your library or to find online. It's a new way of thinking about development, and it has been tremendously influential in the past decades. According to Sen, development is the process of expanding human freedoms. Now, this might seem very abstract to some of you. Why do we need to be free to be developed? But let's see what Sen means when he states this. According to him, freedom is the primary goal. So, in other words, we should strive for more freedom. But freedom, once you are free, it's also your principal means to achieve development. And what is really interesting, particularly in the discussion, is development better achieved under authoritarian rule or under democratic rule? According to Amartya Sen, political participation and dissent are in fact crucial parts of development itself. In other words, development without the possibility of the population to be involved, to disagree, to think through the different alternatives, according to him, that type of development is not really valuable or less valuable. When he talks about freedom, it's not only kind of political freedom or the freedom to make your own decisions in terms of your personal life, but he looks at 5 different categories that are important. First of all, political freedoms. In other words, if you live under authoritarian rule and there's no free press and you are oppressed, it's very hard to shape your own life. But he also looks at economic freedoms, economic facilities, access to economic and financial opportunities. Can you start your own business? Is it easy for anyone in society to be economically active? Are there enough jobs? Then, very importantly, social opportunities. In other words, do people have access to health and education? Think about it. If you are unhealthy, if you're sick and you don't have access to medicine or to the help of a nurse or a doctor, can you then work properly? Can you cater for your family? The fourth one is interesting and maybe also important when we look at American politics, when we look at some of the major issue that countries in Europe are struggling with at the moment, thinking about Hungary, thinking about Poland, thinking about also the Netherlands having serious issues with corruption. He calls them transparency guarantees. In other words, a country must have institutions to deal with anti-corruption, to make sure that citizens know what's going on, that they can hold their leaders and their business people to account, etc. A country without transparency, where deals are being made by the elite behind the backs of the average citizen, is not a country where development can flourish. And then, interestingly, Amartya Sen talks about protective security. In other words, he talks about safety nets, that quite often these are state safety nets, that there should be some kind of social safety when things go terribly wrong in society. So, for example, during COVID, we now see that many governments are supporting businesses to pay salaries, to keep jobs, etc. Maybe some of you say, this is only for wealthy countries. But if we take the example of Botswana, a relatively poor country in sub-Saharan Africa, they had the so-called drought relief program. This was a program where the government provided jobs for farmers who were affected by drought. Through this, although small income, farmers could survive during the dry season and not having to eat their seeds for the next year. And this type of protective security really helped farmers to survive. I think the combination of all these freedoms are the necessary checks and balances in society for development to flourish, according to Amartya Sen. And now the step is, we move into debates around poverty, because if we thought about what is important for development, maybe we can also think about what we understand when we think about issues of poverty. And again, like we did earlier, maybe just pause the video for a sec, jot down for yourself how you would define poverty, what you think are issues to consider whether someone is poor or not. According to Amartya Sen, poverty is the deprivation of basic capabilities. In other words, very brief, very shortly phrased, poverty is capability deprivation. In other words, poverty prevents people from fully exploring their capabilities or developing their capabilities. Some of you might have jotted down that poverty is mainly about lack of funds, lack of money. But according to Sen, it's very important, and here we see we see similar elements that we saw in the definition of development, that we think about other crucial deprivations. So according to him, there's usually an overemphasis on income, but we should also take into account ill health, unemployment, lack of education, and social exclusion. Nevertheless, he does acknowledge that income may help and is instrumentally significant and can also help to overcome some of these crucial deprivations. Sen did research in the early 90s, and this was one of the seminal graphs that he came up with. And here we see Kerala state. So this is a state in India where Sen did some of his research. And in Kerala state, the income among people was extremely low, but life expectancy was among the highest on the planet. And at that time, for example, South Africa had a much higher average income, but a much lower life expectancy, or Gabon in Africa. And he tried to think about, what are the explanations that help us compare these countries and why are there these huge differences? That a very poor state still has such high life expectancy at birth. And his lessons were that this high life expectancy is usually also related to high literacy and low fertility. This is a picture from Kerala State, from the Family Health Center. And according to Amartya Sen, it was particularly primary healthcare and basic education, often primary education, that made a huge difference in people's lives. In other words, when every village has a small but very simple clinic to deal with the most basic health issues, and when all children in society have access to basic education to learn to read and write, although these two institutions are very labor intensive, they are very relatively cheap. There's not a lot of technology involved, and huge strides forward can be made in terms of literacy, life expectancy, and fertility numbers. So Sen, through this work, also became one of the architects of the UN Development Programme, and one of the architects behind what we call the Human Development Index. And this was an index to think about poverty and development in a broader fashion, not only looking at monetary resources. It was a composite index that was presented in 1990, and it includes some of the elements that Sen discovered in his research: life expectancy, literacy, education, enrollment, but also GDP per capita. So when you compare countries, not only in terms of the money that the society has available, GDP per capita, but also take into account life expectancy, literacy, and education, you get a different sense of the potential for people to develop themselves. And that's why the Human Development Index became a crucial index for the United Nations. So if we look at the top 5, it's Norway, Switzerland, Ireland, Germany, and Hong Kong. In fact, Germany and Hong Kong are now sharing top 4, the fourth spot. And then there are these, sadly, African countries sharing the lowest, or among the lowest Human Development Index countries. But in the late 1990s, we still saw huge issues in the world in terms of development, and there was a need to formulate more concrete goals and targets, also to improve international cooperation to deal with some of these issues. And at the cusp of the new millennium, we saw the emergence and formulation of the UN Millennium Declaration, and the Millennium Development Goals were launched for a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world. And this was a huge push, building on the work of people like Amartya Sen to deal with development issues in particularly the global south. So these were the Millennium Development Goals. You can look at them online. Hunger, education, gender issues, particularly child mortality, improved maternal health, HIV/AIDS and other diseases, environment, and a global partnership. Although the MDGs were quite successful, and we will read about it, what went well and what went less well, the need was felt to broaden these agendas. And from 8 goals, we moved to 17 goals as of 2016, when the global goals for sustainable development were introduced. And this was particularly because it was realized across the board that issues of ecology and climate were very much more important and had to be addressed in a more fundamental manner. So this course will also look at these SDGs and debate whether this SDG exercise is bringing the types of development that are useful for the poor wherever they live on the planet. When you want to know more about the SDGs, it might be interesting and useful for you to look at the founding document called Agenda 2030, in which more detail is given about the particular SDGs. So what is the background for every goal, and what is considered and what is not considered. You can download it and study it, and it contains useful topics for whatever development topic you're interested in. What kind of world are we living in terms of the changes regarding development? I think here we see a cartoon from 2014 where we see a brick through the mirror or the window of the World Bank. Until that moment, one of the most powerful development institutions in the world, a development institution that was dominated by Western countries. But in 2014, the BRICS countries said, we do not want to be ruled by the World Bank only, and we want to set up our own development bank, and they called it the New Development Bank. However, the BRICS in 2014 were really on an economic up. There were clearly also, even in the world economic crisis, they were first relatively strong. And as I said earlier, there were developing countries that were in the crisis supporting richer countries like Angola, supporting Portugal. But from, let's say, 2013, 2014 onwards, we see that the BRICS countries have experienced some serious problems. So there was an Indian rupee crisis, its monetary unit. We saw particularly Russia dealing with some severe economic hardship around issues in Ukraine, falling oil prices, issues around the oil price having to do with tensions in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. China saw some major crisis on the Chinese stock exchange. We recently saw, due to the trade wars with Trump, that China is doing less well as it did before, although it's still a very powerful upcoming economy. Particularly Brazil has been hit by economic, social and political crisis in the last 5 years. After Bolsonaro came to power, more authoritarian type of political governance has set in. One could say that this is a type of populism that we see in many places on earth. I guess even in the Netherlands we see the rise of populist politics, and certainly the Trump administration displays some of these characteristics. So in 2015, Goldman Sachs even announced the closure of the BRICS investment fund after almost 90% value drop. So yes, the BRICS countries are still a force to reckon with, but what you also see is that they are not as powerful and not as let's say carefree as a few years ago. What happens now in terms of COVID is of course something else completely, because all our nations, whether it's in the West or in developing countries, are suffering huge losses in terms of life, health, etc., but also economically. This new development bank that was created by the BRICS was particularly financed by China in terms of the investment that was put in. China put in 48 billion, and it was there to build new infrastructure and to have access to funds for sustainable development projects. So it's interesting to look at, visit the site and see what they've been doing. The first chair of this institution came from Russia, the president from China. The headquarters would be in Shanghai, and a regional center in South Africa. So this is also really saying to the rich nations, we no longer want to be dependent on institutions like the World Bank and IMF that are largely governed by Western nations. So what are some of the other new institutions beside the New Development Bank? A really important one is the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the AIIB, also mainly Chinese funded. But it's interesting that major EU countries have joined this initiative because they think that financing development initiatives, particularly in infrastructure in Asia and other developing countries, may give good returns. And then there is the new Silk Road Fund, also Chinese, which is one of the major funds behind the One Belt, One Road initiative that I spoke to you about earlier. So let's look again at this One Belt, One Road. As I said, infrastructure, railroads, maritime infrastructure, ports, roads, railroads, etc. But at the same time also important in terms of ICTs, the 5G networks, new software, and new data. And that's something that the West and also other developing countries are partly worried about. At the same time, it also gives countries access to new funding, new opportunities, whereby they are no longer only dependent for investment and development initiative from Western countries. So a major initiative that will have huge impacts on global development, and also on the debates that we will have in this course and other courses on where the opportunities and challenges are. What type of investment are we talking about? So this is 2019. The Bank of China had approved more than 140 billion US dollars of credit and funded over 600 major projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. Sri Lanka, and this already shows you one of the problems. Sri Lanka handed over its port to China, and making clear that this was not about only Chinese altruism here, but basically Sri Lanka defaulted on some of the debts that were involved in building this port. The Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, and because they couldn't pay the debt, they actually handed over the port to the Chinese, so the Chinese now own this port. And I think what is really important is to realize that One Belt, One Road is impacting us all in terms of our future, in terms of our access to infrastructure, in terms of major developments that we are dealing with in the coming decades. So let's end with some fun facts about China, where we also see the ambition in Chinese companies, in Chinese entrepreneurs, and in the Chinese government. So particularly until recently, it was also Chinese companies that were investing. The Chinese Communist Party has halted this partly in the last 2 years, 3 years. But Chinese companies invested 108 billion in buying up foreign companies. So, for example, in high tech, in utilities, chemical industry, insurance, hotels, soccer club. Alibaba founder Jacques Ma, he buys Bordeaux Chateau de Sour. So 100 French wine chateaus over the years have been bought by Chinese investors. And when we look at the whole of 2015, China has invested 101 billion in buying these usually Western companies, where it's not only about taking over the company, but it's also accessing the knowledge behind or embedded in these companies. So this is also about gaining technological knowledge and technological advantage. That was it for me for now. Thanks very much. I hope it was, even though we didn't see each other, it was inspiring, and it helps you to think about some of the topics that might interest you in your own research in the coming months and maybe in the coming years. Looking forward to meeting you physically whenever and wherever, and talk to you soon. Thank you.